Business news now. Meetings in Britain's historical financial district, called the City of London, are usually genteel affairs. But over the past few years, the annual shareholder meeting of Barclays Bank has taken on a raucous tone, and 2023 is no exception. Shareholder activists shouted down management, accusing the top team of abetting climate change by providing financial support for fossil fuel companies. Barclays chairman Nigel Higgins expressed some sympathy for the activists' argument, but insisted that he's not about to abandon energy companies. And that declaration did not endear him to protesters both inside and outside the meeting hall. Take a listen.
Burning up the earth, gotta stop it now, baby, we have had enough. Dirty, dirty bag. We have had enough. Climate change is going too fast. Fossil fuels belong in the past. Oil and gas are history.
And that's a group calling themselves the Climate Choir, performing their own take on the classic Spice Girls tune Stop. Well, for more on this and the rest of the day's business news, hopefully she won't be singing that business news. She'll be talking about the crucial rate-setting meeting in the US, amongst other things. Let's cross over to London to speak to Arise business correspondent Laurie Laird. Good to see you, Laurie.
Yeah, Charles, I'm going to spare you. I will not be singing to you this evening, and I
Well,
think all of our
thank
viewers will be
you
relieved about
so
that.
much. Thank you. Well, we prefer you talking because you make a lot of sense when you do. And another raucous Barclays shareholder meeting, the climate activists, they're not having much joy though, are they?
No, they're not. But I'll tell you, Charles, these AGM annual general meetings for Barclays have become something that we all watch out for, because climate activists have really targeted Barclays. And what their point is look, Barclays, you are a big profitable bank, and you are making some of that money by lending to fossil fuel companies, and we would like that to end. And we have heard this argument before. It is not an unreasonable argument. The problem that Barclays has is that they are making money by lending to these companies, and that with that money they're making money for pension fund holders and for shareholders. So it puts Barclays and a number of other banks in very difficult positions. Who are they meant to favor here? Are they meant to look after their shareholders? Are they meant to look after their investors? Or are they meant to look after the environment? So regardless of the fact that climate change is an important thing, and there's going to need to be a financial solution to this, it's difficult for activists to say to Barclays, stop making money, when so many other people, so many other stakeholders rely on the money that Barclays makes.
A lot of sense. I mean, the whole point of a bank is to make money, but then I suppose there's got to be some ethics around it. But of course, Barclays, Laurie, and other big banks are having great results this quarter. Even as smaller banks in the US are suffering. You've talked to us about that quite a lot. I mean, what accounts for the difference?
I mean, this is very interesting, this dichotomy between these very big banks and these small regional banks that are really getting hammered in the US. The reason the big banks are doing well is because they make so much out of their money, particularly here in the UK, where retail operations have been what's called ring-fenced. They've been separated from riskier investment banking activity. Now that interest rates are rising, banks that make their money from lending to customers, individual customers like you and me, or commercial customers, they can charge more money on those loans, higher interest rates on those loans than they could than when interest rates were at zero or slightly above. So that has increased the margins, greatly increased the margins at some of these very big banks like Barclays, like HSBC, like Lloyd's. We had some very, very good results from Lloyd's earlier today. They have been able to increase their margins, so they're doing very, very well. Now, let's take this a little bit further. The big banks doing incredibly well, these smaller regional banks not doing so well. When these smaller regional banks have got into trouble, they've been taken over by these bigger banks. Now, Charles, let's think back to I know you're just old enough to remember 2007, 2008, when we had so many bank failures. What was the buzzword then? Too big to fail. And it feels to me like we have to start thinking about whether banks have become too big to fail. JP Morgan, which took over First Republic in the US, has now become, and there were waivers to allow that to happen because JP Morgan is already such a big bank. They were meant to be prevented from taking on even more of the banking market. We now have a very big bank. Yes, it looks very, very safe, pretty well regulated, but it's now stopped. It's a more complicated bank. It's harder to regulate. Do regulators understand what is happening with JP Morgan? And let's take that a little bit further. Let's look at that forced marriage between Credit Suisse and UBS in Switzerland. We now have a bank that has assets that are 2.5 times the size of Swiss GDP. Now, if that's a bank that gets into trouble, how do you rescue that bank? So I think it's worth thinking about with these big banks that are doing well, if they are forced to come in and rescue weaker competitors, are we creating a situation like we saw in 2007, 2008, where we have these massive, hard to regulate banks? Yes, regulation is so much stronger than it was in those days, but we tend to see that regulation fights to a certain extent the last battle, doesn't quite fight, almost by definition. It can't see what's happening around the corner. So I do think this is something we have to be aware of, this proliferation of big banks.
That's a very good point. And you mentioned 2007, 2008. I think I was just out of diapers then.
Yes, and I didn't mean to be presumptuous there, Charles.
But anyway, many, business analysts like yourself wondering if banking troubles in the US could affect the Federal Reserve's decision-making process.
This is such a hotly anticipated result, and we will get the results of the Fed meeting just after we go off air, and our colleagues at Rise Exchange will be explaining them to you. And it has to be that the Fed takes a look at what is happening in the banking world. There is no question in anyone's mind that some of these banks are going to be a lot more reluctant to lend. They're going to look at credit quality, their borrowers' quality a lot more closely. I do think we're going to see a tightening in lending standards. That may mean that the Fed does not have to raise interest rates as much as they may have, despite the fact that inflation is still well above the Fed's target of 2%. The betting is that the Fed will raise interest rates by 0.25 percentage point, less than that 0.5 percentage point that we saw late last year, early this year. And then the betting is that the Fed will take a pause by then. But I think people are not just looking at how much the Fed raises rates today. They're also looking for some guidance. Is the Fed going to sit on its hands for a while, despite the fact inflation is high, because we are seeing a slowdown in the U.S. economy?
Briefly, Laurie, we've got less than a minute. A number of U.S. lawmakers pleading with the Fed to stop raising rates.
Yeah, and this, I think, let's come back to in time to come. But yes, a bunch of Democratic lawmakers led by Elizabeth Warren, a former presidential candidate, have written to the Fed to say, stop raising interest rates. You risk putting the economy into recession. You risk crashing the economy, putting small business out of business. And this raises the question, Charles, of whether the Fed is becoming subject to political interference. And this is something we've seen over the past couple of months, not least with Liz Truss during her very, very short time as Prime Minister here in the UK. She did talk about reining in the Bank of England. And I think it's very easy for politicians to support central banks when rates are low, but when rates are going higher, I do see we're seeing this risk of political meddling. And it's something that I think policymakers, central bankers are going to have to keep an eye on.
Laurie, thank you very much indeed. Laurie Laird, Arise business correspondent, talking to me there from London.